This is Brian, screenfiles.com in review. What I'm looking at today is 2017's The Snare, directed by C.A. Cooper. The Snare was released through Uncork'd Entertainment, which, as far as I'm aware, don't actually make movies. Let's say there's a film festival or whatever. They'll purchase a movie. Now the thing which is interesting is that they purchase really mediocre movies at best. And this is strange because it's an odd thing to be recognized for. Because if you think about it, no matter what you say about the Asylum, they have a niche. They do a certain thing well. They do exploitation films, they do low budget films, they do cheesy films. But they're consistent. And sometimes they even do really good things. It's rare, but it happens. Uncork'd Entertainment buys crappy movies. This seems to be their business model. And it almost seems that there's a person who works at Uncork'd Entertainment whose entire job is to find the most mediocre films that they can and purchase them. Which once again is a weird niche to occupy. And as The Snare began, the logo for Uncork'd Entertainment popped up. And the first thing that crossed my mind was, oh no, this is not going to be good. Should I even bother watching it? And I did, and I'm glad I did. Though despite the problems that The Snare has, and there are a few of them, it is probably the best movie that I've seen from Uncork'd Entertainment thus far. The Snare revolves around a woman named Alice, played by Ife Forward, and it ends up in a very Twilight Zone space as she goes on a small vacation with her friend Lizzie, who's played by Rachel Warren, and Lizzie's boyfriend, who's played by Dan Patton. Though the odd thing about The Snare in general is that Alice is the center of the movie. Yet Alice is curiously inactive. She is inert as a character. That's not to say Ife Forward is a bad actress. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is, based on the story and the direction, she has little motivation. She is not quite a cipher, but she is not very interesting and engaging as a character. So therefore, it's almost a question of why she's there at all. And keep in mind, as I said, the movie gets very Twilight Zone once they arrive at this apartment building. Though Carl drives her there, and Lizzie is the person who gets the apartment. Alice is once again passive. Even when she's active, she's in her own way passive. And it's a very frustrating character to have to watch because she initiates nothing. She just goes along with things. And if your movie doesn't revolve around that particular type of person, it's fine. If they're a secondary or tertiary character, it's less important. Though, as I said, the movie revolves around Alice. So the fact that she is so almost not there is really concerning. Another thing is that the relationship between Alice and Lizzie doesn't really work, at least as presented, because Alice is so withdrawn and so reserved, while Lizzie is vivacious and laughs a lot. The two of these people coming together without good reason makes no sense. I get the idea that opposites sometimes attract, but the movie never gives us a reason why Lizzie would even be a friend of Alice's. Now the thing is, to establish that would have been relatively simple. Show them working in the same place. Show them interacting prior to going on this trip. Let the viewer know that there is a valid reason for Lizzie to be with Alice. Because as the movie plays out, it doesn't make any sense. Alice is a tabula rasa. She just kind of fades into the background. She should not have been the center of this movie. Never mind having the entire story revolve around Alice. Throughout the movie, you see Alice writing in a diary. And based upon what she writes, she sounds depressed. Which is okay, in the sense that people are sometimes depressed. It happens. But no one seems aware of it. Her father doesn't seem particularly aware of it. Lizzie doesn't seem particularly aware of it. Carl could give a shit. And I'll get back to Carl later. Though, it's just the idea that she is so mopey in general that if depression is what she's dealing with, Lizzie, who is supposedly her friend, doesn't even seem to notice at all. Which doesn't, once again, make sense. Especially if these two women have the relationship that the movie implies. Namely, they are friends and they like being around each other and so on and so forth. I just don't see it. I don't see why anyone would want to be around Alice, because she is not disagreeable more than she's just kind of blah. She's like beige, if beige were a person. The story tells us that the building that the trio are vacationing in was one that Lizzie's father, who's a realtor, learned about, and Lizzie took the keys to this building. Now, I've never been in the UK, but why a fully furnished building is sitting empty kind of eludes me. It's just there. No one lives in it. I think the building is probably 7 or 8 stories tall, yet not a single person lives there. And it doesn't feel like the building is new, in the sense that it was recently built. It just feels like it's sitting there, which doesn't really make any sense. So as I said, I don't live in the UK. I don't understand how they would handle renting apartments or condos or whatever. Though it seems a little odd to me that you'd have an entire 7 or 8 story building just sitting around. No one in it at all. So once they arrive at this building, they buy some food at a local shop. It goes without saying that they only buy enough food for 2 or 3 days, never mind a week, which still wouldn't be enough considering how long these people appear to be trapped in this building. But at least if you bought enough food for a week, it would make a little more sense. Though Alice begins to get visions of a little girl, and the little girl in one instance is prodding her to kill herself. This is interesting, but as I mentioned before, it puts Alice at the center of the movie. And Alice, as written by C.A. Cooper, is not a really interesting character. And it goes without saying that she's having these dreams night after night. She's getting hallucinations of this little girl and this older woman who seems intent on killing her. But she doesn't mention this at all to anyone. Now, I can see that she wouldn't mention this to Carl, because as I said, Carl's a bit of a dick, and I will get to him, I promise. Why not mention it to Lizzie? At least give her some clue of what's going on. I should mention that it appears that Alice's father is abusing her sexually, which is kind of confusing, if only because Alice is an adult. Her father is an older person. He's bigger than her, but older nonetheless. And he walks around with a crutch. It's very strange to me that Alice, if she really wanted to get away from him, couldn't. Never mind, Alice seems to live in the same house as he does. And there's a scene earlier in the movie, I assume it's visiting her mother's grave or something. It doesn't really say, but that's the feeling you get. And Alice is changing clothes, and her father just walks right in. What came to mind to me at first was, why didn't Alice at least, I don't know, close the door? Or dare I say, lock the door? I don't know if the door even had a lock, but seeing that she didn't even try to close it was kind of weird. And that her father is at points openly ogling her because she tries to change clothes in front of him. Why she did that and didn't, I don't know, say, get the fuck out of my room is weird to me. I don't quite understand what the Snare is trying to say about Alice's relationship with her father, other than it seems very sexually abusive. Though it also seems that Alice is kind of letting it happen, which again is a little icky and kind of strange. As I said at the top, Uncork'd Entertainment movies tend to be really mediocre. I want to say bad, but they're really not. They tend to have good production value. They tend to look like movies, though they tend to lack in the story area, which is really important because the entire movie, no matter what it is based upon the story. And if the story sucks, the movie more than likely is going to suck too. So their movies aren't really good. And the Snare has problems, no doubt, some of which I've already spelled out. Though about a third of the way in, the movie lasts a little over an hour and a half, I believe an hour and 38 minutes to be exact. Things begin to pick up as the supernatural occurrences that Alice is at first seeing in visions seem to kind of spill over into the real world. Things get very odd and the movie gets significantly better. This is unusual for an Uncork'd Entertainment movie because they usually start sucky and end sucky. Conversely, the Snare kind of starts kind of weak, but it builds. The errors are there, to be sure, but it's still interesting regardless. So through her visions, Alice comes to realize that of the 3 individuals in the apartment, only one can remain. Now, the impression is also given that this building or apartment, I assume the entire building, has been doing this for a while. Does that make sense? Not really, because at some point you think people would notice that people are dying a lot in this particular apartment or this particular building and something would be done. Heck, at some point I would imagine that if enough people died in a particular apartment, the building would be razed to the ground potentially, because how would other people not know about it? The Snare isn't a movie that syncs particularly well, in the sense that when you think about it, beyond the problems I've already listed, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. And it's worth mentioning that the secret sauce of the Snare is Dan Patton, who plays Carl. He is such a douchebag and such a horn dog. He is, for the most part, an awful person. And he is awful long before he gets to this apartment. Though Dan Patton is a really good actor, and his Carl is just interesting. He's an asshole, to be sure. He is just not a great person, and he gets worse as the entity exerts its influence upon him. But he is interesting. He is the motor that drives the latter part of the Snare. He doesn't make the movie good because the first third of it isn't going to go away, but he makes it engaging and worth watching in the latter 2/3 of the movie. And unfortunately, Lizzie, who is Alice's friend, is kind of just there. She's present, but really not. It's not that the actress is bad, she's not. It's just that she's underwritten and she just vanishes for periods of time. As I mentioned earlier, this story is Alice's story. Why S.A. Cooper decided to make her so weak-willed and just kind of blah is really strange, because this is her story. Whether it ends in a good or bad way, it ends in a bad way. It's her story, but she lacks motivation, she lacks drive. So Lizzie doesn't really help compensate for that, because she's barely in a movie, and when she is, she's just kind of there. She's not really doing anything. She's not really driving the action. That's one reason I think Carl is just so awesome. Dan Patton acts up a storm in the role, and he's just so reprehensible. He's awful as a person. But when you're not given a contrast to Carl, you go with what you had. So I really enjoyed his performance, despite the awfulness of his character. The Snare is not a great movie by any stretch of the imagination, though it is better than what we typically get from Uncork'd Entertainment, and it doesn't quite mesh as well as it could. But Dan Patton saves a lot of this movie. Now what do you think? This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com and Review. Do you agree, disagree? Let me know down below. And as usual, consider a like or a follow.